Hi, welcome to this overview of budget for Portland Utility Board members. My name is Amy Archer Masters. I am not recording this in a live meeting. This is just pre-recorded so that I can share it with pub members and cover the basics outside of our typical meeting time. All right, so most of you should have seen this slide before in your onboarding training. So I'm sharing it primarily as a reminder of PUB's various roles. The PUB is a community-based board providing formal recommendations to council, as well as budgetary and policy oversight and recommendations to the two major utility bureaus, Portland Water Bureau and Bureau of Environmental Services. The formation of the PUB stated that the board shall be active and actively involved in upstream deliberations on utility bureau budgets, capital spending, policies, and programs. It also, the founding ordinance stated that the utility board would serve as the budget advisory committee for the Portland Water Bureau and the Bureau of Environmental Services. So budget feedback is one of the primary roles, which overlaps with a lot of the other areas that are listed on the screen, but that will be the focus of what we're talking about today. So let's just talk about some very basics of city budget planning. First of all, budgets help cities plan how to use their money to achieve their strategic goals and communicate about priorities, investments, and accurately account for their money. As I mentioned, one of the key roles for the PUB is to make recommendations to the bureaus. The budget is done annually, and it is adopted by council by June 30th. And we are currently just in the middle of fiscal year 2024-25, which is for the period of July 1st, 2024 through June 30th of 2025. There's also some other budget monitoring processes that take place through the year just to true up the budget and make it current with what is actually happening during that year. So those are some other aspects that also occasionally come before the PUB. As I mentioned, the PUB serves as the budget advisory committee for the two utility bureaus. The budget process typically happens from November until May, so a good portion of the year is spent doing budgeting. Let's see, budget advisory committees have been seen as a best practice to ensure that there's public engagement in jurisdiction's budget development. It was previously required of all bureaus. This year is a little bit different just because there's so much transition related to the charter changes and the change in leadership at the city. But many bureaus are still operating with budget advisory committees, and the two utility bureaus are still working closely with PUB and engaging them as their budget advisory committee in this process. So that's been taking place really since PUB's creation, and is part of their formal role throughout the process. Because they serve as a budget advisory committee, it's one of the reasons that when PUB was formed, a labor position was designated as one of the voting positions on the board, and that continues to be true. What's a little bit different this year is the involvement of the city administrator and the deputy city administrators. So there's a bit more guidance that's provided through those folks in leadership. And PUB is engaging with Priya Dhanapal, who is the deputy city administrator over public works. Over the years, PUB has increasingly focused on upstream policy and programmatic level decisions that inform the budget, rather than just focusing on the detailed numbers, line items of the budget. However, each year, PUB gets to decide how to approach the budget development process. So we'll talk a little bit about that further on in this training. So just to give some perspective of where the city of Portland lies in the kind of complex landscape of local government in the area, this just highlights some of the other key jurisdictions that are involved in a lot of the services that are provided to the residents and businesses that operate in the Portland area. It's just a reminder that what budget is focused on for the city of Portland are the services that are listed here, whereas some other services such as human services, public health are provided by the county, or some transportation services, public transportation services are provided through TriMet. So there's just a little bit of distinction as far as where the money is focused that we're talking about when we move into budget. The City of Portland provides funding for the City Administrator's Office and the 6 service areas listed here, including budget, operations, and finance, the public safety, vibrant communities, community and economic development, and of course, public works, which is where you'll focus most of your time. The city's elected offices also receive funding. They're not listed on the slide here. But the service areas specifically under Public Works include the 2 utility bureaus that the pub focuses on, as well as transportation. And transportation has their own advisory committees related to their budget, but those 3 bureaus all work together on their joint budget documents and presentation. When we're talking about budget for the City of Portland, just want to remind folks that the majority of the city's budget is restricted for specific purposes and can legally only be spent on those services. These include things like our sewer and water rates, which must be spent on operating and maintaining water and sewer system. Some other dedicated resources include gas tax revenues, permitting revenues, or other charges for specific services or grants that have legally restricted services that can be provided. So only 10% of the city's budget is part of that general fund discretionary pot of money, where there are fewer restrictions on what could be funded. And so that's where of the city's $8 billion budget, a lot of the city council and leadership's time is spent on determining where those general fund dollars are going, since there is a little bit more discretion. The majority of those general fund dollars are providing core services such as public safety services, police, fire, and 911 call taking system. It also contributes a substantial amount to parks and recreation and other community development services, including houseless services and planning. The pub does not spend a lot of time talking about general fund dollars since your focus is on rates and those are restricted dollars. And so that's where your focus of time is. However, sometimes there are some general fund dollars that are allocated to the utilities for specific projects or services that cannot be funded through rates, such as in the past it has been funding for Mount Tabor reservoirs, which are not part of the water delivery system anymore. Or for specific funding that is provided, such as currently BES services are getting funding through the Portland Clean Energy Fund. So those are some that are outside of rates that may be discussed in the upcoming months and year. I share this just so that you have an idea of where the budget conversation focuses. So if we look at the full city's budget for the current year that we're in, it's, as I mentioned, about $8 billion, pardon me. And almost half of that is public works. So that includes water, environmental services, and transportation. The state of Oregon budget law requires that the city report its total legal budget, which is defined to include all the operating costs and internal transactions between funds. Because it includes those internal transactions, for utilities, it can sometimes, and some other bureaus, it can sometimes make the numbers seem a bit inflated or overstated because there's a substantial fund balance that carries forward year to year and a lot of transfers between the funds. So the 4.04 billion listed here would include some of those items that aren't actually operational or related directly to service. It's a lot of fund transfers. So they're not discretionary amounts that can be allocated to operations or services. If we dive in a little bit into that 4.04 billion, that's for public works. Almost 1 billion of it is for capital. Of the public works budget, about 85% is for utilities, with about 1.8 billion for water in the red there, and 1.65 billion for Bureau of Environmental Services, or BES, in the blue. And then the remainder portion, the orange, is what transportation is reflected. This is pulling from a dashboard that is available on the city's public website. So there are some details that are available if you hover over any section of this pie chart or some of the other charts on that dashboard. You can see a bit more detail about the programs within them and the funding for the current year. Again, just want to note that because of the complexity of the utility funds and all of those financial elements with transfers and debt service, the annual budget as to what can actually be spent in that year is a little bit different than what you'll see in those charts. So some of the data that you'll get directly from the bureaus will be a little more helpful as far as considering where there's any flexibility or decisions or trade-offs to be considered. The revenues from the rates and fees for the current year was projected to be about $450 million for environmental services and $295 million for water. And that makes up the majority of their operating and capital budgets. Which makes the utilities substantially reliant on the rate increases in order to manage inflation and projected increases in expenses. They may draw from rate stabilization funds, bonds, debt service, and other resources for the full budget, but that will also impact future years since their financial plan builds in those annual increases. I'll come back to that future planning piece a little bit further on. The next several slides draw from the Utility Bureau's rate hearing, which was last spring. So the actual numbers vary slightly from what you see on the screen here, but I'm providing these because they're good summary tables and some things that you may see similar documents as we move into budget development for the current year. It will look somewhat familiar. So I just want to orient you to them a bit to give a sense of what the overall utility financial status is. I'll just touch on them briefly, and then if there's questions, we can always come back to these. Or if you want, more poignant review of these materials, you can also view the Bureau leadership's presentations during the last budget cycle. There was a work session on February 8th and the rate hearing on March 6th. And so the directors of the bureaus provided some of the details on some of these slides and may have provided more information than I'm sharing with you today. This slide in particular shows the breakdown of their planned expenditures for this year. And as you can see, over half of the budget is planned capital improvement expenditures to provide investment in infrastructure. Some of the large projects that are captured in that would, of course, be the major project through Water Bureau, building the filtration plant, and for environmental services, their secondary treatment expansion. The debt service slice indicates the draws for investments that have already been made. And then the lighter portion includes some of the non-discretionary expenses. The remaining quarter that you see at the top left there is the operations and maintenance funds. As mentioned, that's funded by about 90% of that is funded by their rate revenues. The operations and maintenance portions of their budgets are where you'll spend more time reviewing decisions, because that is where there is a little bit more flexibility as to if cuts need to be made, shifting funds based on priorities or issues, challenges, cost pressures that have come up. over the year, and areas where there may be potential service reductions if changes were made to that portion of the budget. The largest portion of the budget, of course, is those capital improvements and debt service for capital projects. The focus on assets, of course, is important in considering the bureaus and their budgets, because they have billions of dollars in combined assets and is consistently assessing the most critical areas for investment to maintain and improve the system. The Bureau's attempt to spread the costs of capital projects over many years to mitigate any large fluctuations in rates for consumers and to support more generational equity for financing long lifespan assets, particularly when cuts are needed. This dives just a little bit deeper into the assets of the bureaus and the breakdown between water and BES and the condition of those assets. As I mentioned, this is important as they're considering investments. Fortunately, because of their rate-funded system and their good planning, a lot of their assets the majority of them are in very good and fair condition, which is where you want your assets to be. And there's fewer that are in the poor, very poor, or unknown. That unknown category is due to the inability to assess the status of those components. For example, components that may be under high pressure water, and so you can't view the interior of them without major shutdown to the system. But this combined poor, very poor, and unknown, even though it's a smaller portion of their overall assets, it still adds up to $3.9 billion in those conditions, which of course is a risk. Obviously, when there are repairs that need to be made because of a system failure, those costs are much more expensive. And so when maintenance is deferred, that increases the risk and the potential cost for repairs. This next slide, I'm not going to talk about much, but I do share it because it's something that you'll see periodically. This is provided just as an overview of so for the customer who's receiving a bill, understanding a little bit of where their money is going. So you can see the breakdown between the system and what the various components are. On the right, it provides a little bit of a definition of the water system, sewer system, stormwater system, the Portland Harbor Superfund, and of course the base charge, which is just the core services. So the water system and the sewer system are based on volume and usage. So those have metrics behind them. And then the stormwater includes both on-site and off-site charges. Some of those on-site charges can be reduced if folks implement systems that manage their stormwater runoff within their property through the Clean River Rewards program. Each year, you'll see summaries like this chart that provide an overview of, given what the Bureau is requesting or that Council has approved, what the current bill versus the proposed bill would look like. This is helpful since we like to look at what the potential impact is on the customers of these services. And it's also a way to look at the affordability and of the rate impact and the decisions that are being made on a typical monthly bill for a single family residence. This again pulls from the utility rate hearing, so the actuals are slightly different, but you can see at that point in time when they were considering that % of rate increase, the monthly bill impact would have been, for the typical family, $8.88 combined for the water and sewer and stormwater services. Affordability is a significant component of the Bureau's planning and of pub's interest in considering rate increases. And so you can see on this chart the impacts of their low income discount program, which is one of their programs to support through financial assistance customers that are struggling or more vulnerable. It's based on median family income that they qualify, and you can see for those given years, what the increase would have resulted in for those bills. Each year, you'll also see a comparison to other peer jurisdictions or neighboring utilities. This is provided just to understand how the changes are related to jurisdictions that are comparable to the city of Portland or immediately around us. As you can see, Portland falls in the middle. And is anticipated to continue to do so. Some of the other peer jurisdictions have already completed filtration, whereas the City of Portland is currently implementing that, so our costs are slightly higher, but they have not done combined sewer overflow, which the City of Portland has already invested in. So there's probably some comparability as far as costs that they're anticipating for those jurisdictions in the coming years. We anticipate, or at least the Bureau's anticipated, Portland remaining somewhere in the middle of all of that. As I mentioned, the bureaus are in a long-term planning business. So when they're planning for their investments, they're building infrastructure to last 50 to 100 plus years. This means that their capital planning process is a complex one, and it's evolving and planning far off into the future, as well as the preventive maintenance that's required in the immediate. This means that a lot of decisions are being made long before they fall into the annual budget. So the annual budget is just a one-year snapshot in a much longer plan. The bureaus at a minimum have a 5-year financial plan that is reviewed and approved by council each year. So that projects what is anticipated for the next 5 years. But of course, their capital plan goes much further than that as they're working on building and investing in infrastructure right now, as well as planning for those years out into the future to ensure some stability in the rates. This rate projection, again, was based on the approved financial plans at the time that it was submitted last spring. So, of course, this is evolving as council has made decisions that impact those planned rates. And the current mayor guidance for the development of this next year's budget has directed bureaus to come in below what was planned for this year. That will have an impact. The mayor's guidance also directs not to impact the future years. So that means that some decisions will need to be made in order to manage that without impacting the future rates. You'll see an updated version of this coming in the coming months. Just a little bit more about the rates that you see on the screen. As I mentioned, they are working towards predictable planning without over-reliance on debt in order to fund capital investments. For Portland Water Bureau, the blue line at the top, it's slightly higher than typical, and that, of course, is because of the investment in the filtration plant that is happening right now. About a third of the rate increase is for federally mandated filtration and pipelines. A third is the ongoing investment in infrastructure, and a third was for the increased costs for labor and materials. For BES, similarly, theirs is the green line at the bottom. The increase that was projected there was to maintain current levels of service, as well as planning for future large investments that are known, as well as some unknown costs that are predicted in the coming years. The black line in the middle is the combined rate and the impact that we talk about when we look at the impact to individual bills. Not pictured right here, but you'll also hear conversation about service development charges, or referred to as SDCs. For some bureaus, or most bureaus, when they're collecting SDCs, that is to fund being funded by development in order to meet future capacity growth needs. For example, in parks, their SDCs, they're planning for parks that as population grows, that there would be new parks. For water and BES, this is different. They're collecting for charges and expenses that have already been incurred to expand capacity for developments. For example, when the city of Portland invested in the Big Pipe project, that was necessary both to manage all of the flow. It also was built in a way to manage future growth. And so development charges do go into funding that work that has already been done and paying off that debt service. As we move into the budget development, you'll hear more about from the bureaus about challenges they're facing, rate pressures, and impacts of prior decisions on their planning for current and future investments. So we'll get more into that when we get into this year. So kind of backing back out to the citywide process, every year the city's adopted budget must be balanced. Pretty straightforward. If expenses increase and revenues don't, then you need to cut somewhere to reach balance. If expenses and revenues are both going up, then you're okay. If revenues have gone up and expenses have stayed the same, then you may have new funds to invest or to set aside for future investments. This year, the city is facing a deficit for the city's general fund. So initial guidance is based off of that. And based on the revenue reduction, will require some reduction in expenses. The majority of the utility budget, as mentioned, is from rates, though some limited general fund may be provided for projects, as was discussed. When citywide general fund is requiring reductions, as they are in the coming year, that makes removal of those funds more likely, for bureaus, especially like the utilities, where they have rate funding for their core services, whereas other services may rely more heavily or completely on general fund resources. You'll hear more from the utility bureaus about their specific expense pressures. We've heard a lot in recent years about increases just due to inflation, and particularly the cost of construction and investment in infrastructure. Really, since COVID, that has had substantial increases. Some other key elements that are also having citywide impact, both for the utilities as well as the others who rely on general fund resources, include significant workforce cost increases, such as healthcare and benefits, 12% increase. That's really significant, as well as labor agreements that are still in negotiations and will have impact on the budget, and other overtime in public safety has had an impact, as well as legal obligations, some citywide, some that are driving utility investments, such as filtration and Portland Harbor. Charter reform, of course, also had expense impact on all bureaus, including the utilities, just as leadership is reorganized and costs are being reallocated as a result, and services being reviewed. So some of those are still evolving as time moves on. So as I mentioned, a lot is in transition with the governance changes and the leadership structure shift in Portland. Rather than spend time kind of understanding what the past budget process looked like, I'll just really focus on what we know of the key elements of the current budget process. With that said, there's still dates and specifics of kind of the coming months for the citywide process that are unknown. So as we learn more, we'll be sharing that with PUB. but the overall process is what is captured on the screen here. So the early phases have been the mayor's release of the budget guidance and service areas starting to work on their budget preparation. So that takes place in fall. And as they move into winter, December, January, the service areas are working on their draft budgets, reviewing budget concepts based on the mayor's guidance with the deputy city administrators and the leadership structure. Um, and then as we move forward into next year in early 2025, then we'll move on to the further phases of the budget, which include all the deputy city administrators working with the city administrator to kind of create a unified proposed budget, and the mayor proposing that budget and submitting it to council. And then throughout the remainder of the year, May through June, approving and adopting the budget. So as mentioned previously, that needs to be adopted by the end of June so that it can be implemented starting July 1st when the fiscal year begins. So the major difference from the old process to the new is that kind of more centralized look at the budget with the deputy city administrators and the city administrator kind of working on citywide on those service areas and attempting to achieve some balance in the budget. So hopefully that will result in some earlier information and clearer information for the public to respond to when it comes time for the mayor's proposed to come out and for the public to provide feedback on that. During spring, there will be a range of opportunities for engagement, which includes through budget advisory committees or BACs like the pub, so that all of you will be engaging in that, as well as just opportunity for the general public to provide feedback on the proposed and trial budgets. They accept written comments through the website, and then, of course, public testimony at work sessions and other survey feedback that has been collected by bureaus and citywide for consideration as the budget moves forward. So just a quick overview. As I mentioned, the budget guidance from the mayor included 5% reductions for general fund and specific guidance related to the utility bureaus. So the guidance was to limit the combined rate increase to 5.94%, which is lower than what was part of their approved financial plan. So that results in approximately 5% reductions for each of the bureaus. And it directs future years not to be adjusted or increased from prior projections in order to compensate for the lower rate that is being approved for this year. So what will your engagement look like, and what information do you have to review? First of all, if you have any information requests, certainly share those with me and staff, and we work with the bureaus to gather information as the process goes on. You do have what has already been shared, the mayor's budget guidance. You'll get information from the bureaus about their budget process, rate projections, cost pressures, summary of prior budget reductions and priorities. That's the planned presentation in December. You'll get more information on budget concepts to meet the mayor's guidance in the January meetings. And then, of course, we'll have the actual budget documents through the draft or trial budget, which will include program offer summaries with descriptions of their program areas, the budgets for those areas, equity impacts, and performance measure data. So that should be available by February. And then, of course, there's capital improvement plans, 5-year financial plans, and then other documents that are provided based on the Q&A that takes place. The budget documents themselves are quite lengthy. The goal through those program offer summaries is to try to summarize information as succinctly as possible so that it's understandable to the public. But of course, BES, I believe, has 16 programs. Water Bureau has 23. So even in summary form, that adds up to a lot of paperwork. Their budget documents usually end up being 200 or 300 pages or more. It's a lot of detail to cover. So often Pub has prioritized kind of their areas of focus and questions that they ask on areas that either impact equity or are undergoing significant change. So each year the Pub discusses their budget approach and identifies whether there's any priorities they want to discuss with the bureaus and have them focus on in their presentations. They've shared some early information that is informing the presentation on December 19th, and then we'll continue to discuss more as we move forward into the coming months of meetings. Note for those who have engaged with Pub previously, the Pub is not required, or the bureaus are not required to include a letter from their advisory committee with their requested budget information as it has been in the past. So Pub likely will be focusing on those later letters that you provide once you have the detailed information. As Pub moves into budget season, it is a good reminder of looking at the priorities and values that guide their work. So there's several documents and areas of information that capture that information. There is some grounding in code because when Pub was formed, there were some values and areas of focus that were identified, but they continue to evolve based on the evaluation of values and priorities that guide Pub's work. So every year during their work plan process, they review those. So the annual report and work plan are really one of the main documents to look to for a summary of the 4 frames or themes that they use to focus on their year's work. So those 4 frames that have been identified for the current year and consistent with recent years as well is racial equity, climate crisis and climate justice, innovation effectiveness and public transparency, interagency and cross-sector collaboration. So there's more detail on each of those in the annual report document. And they, of course, continue to evolve as well. So they're used just as reminders internally and also as a tool for the bureaus when they're bringing information to the Pub to know what some of your areas of focus are. In addition to that, there's also the more detailed values that are drawn originally from code, but each year Pub reviews to determine whether there's any sort of higher priority items or areas of focus. So you can see on the screen those that have been identified as the main area of focus for this current year, given the circumstances of the condition of infrastructure and vulnerability and affordability concerns. The ones below are still certainly items that Pub considers. They just elevated some to provide some area of focus, particularly if there's trade-offs that need to be considered that either maintain or move forward some of their higher priorities, even with a risk to some of those that are lower. And I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. So that provides the basic overview of how Pub engages in the budget. As always, it evolves based on the current year, what guidance has been provided, and each of the perspectives that members bring to the table. So I welcome follow-up conversations with any of you in whatever format works best for you. Call, email, reach out in whatever way works for you. I'm a resource to make sure that you feel that you have the foundation that you need. And as the discussions move forward, if there's something that's confusing and it's not able to be addressed in a meeting itself, then certainly reach out to me in between meetings and let us know how we can help. Thank you for joining us in this process and for taking the time to review this information. I'll see you all soon.